My parents kicked me out pregnant at 13 and rewrote my life without me, but years later, my return exposed the one lie they couldn't bury. Hello, my name's Althea. When I was 13, I got pregnant and my parents threw me out like I was never theirs. No warning, no conversation, just a door slammed shut behind me. Years later, I came back on my own terms. And what I found wasn't just silence. It was a whole story they rewrote without me. They told people I ran away, that I ruined everything. But what hurts more than being lied about is realizing they never planned to let me come back in the first place. What else did they erase? And how many lies does it take to make a daughter disappear? Let me tell you what really happened. I never saw it coming. Not that day. The sun had already dipped below the line of cypress trees behind our house, and dinner was simmering on the stove. Mama's Sunday roast filled the kitchen, and Clarice, with her church curls still stiff from the morning service, was setting the table like she was preparing an altar. Me? I was just trying to disappear. I kept to myself that day. I always did. I sat in the corner of our back porch sketching faces from memory. Eyes, noses, mouths that I'd never say out loud because I never had the space to. At 13, I had already learned that being quiet kept things calm. Except quiet didn't save me that evening. Mama, Clarice said, smoothing out her napkin like it was a stage prop. I found something in Althea's closet. I froze. My fork stopped midair. I could feel every cell in my body squeeze at once. Clarice didn't look at me. Her eyes were on Mama like she was the judge, and Clarice had just brought in evidence. It was in a shoebox behind her art supplies, she continued slowly with practiced sweetness. A pregnancy test, positive. You'd think a bomb went off in that kitchen. The room didn't explode, but the silence afterward felt louder than anything I'd ever heard. Mama's fingers tightened around her glass of iced tea. Daddy didn't say a word. Clarice finally turned to me and for a second I saw it. The satisfaction, that quiet little smirk she always wore when she won. I should have known. She never wanted truth. She wanted control. Mama stood up. Alpha, she said, not yelling. Not yet. Get in the living room now. I followed her, legs stiff. My heart was pounding so loud I thought she could hear it thumping through my rib cage. She stood in the doorway, hands on hips, Clarice behind her like backup. Is it true? Mama snapped. You brought this shame into my house. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain. I wasn't even sure how. I didn't plan this, and God knows I hadn't understood what was happening until it was too late. But I didn't get a chance. You don't talk, Mama said, voice rising. You listen. You're 13. You can't even drive a car and you're out here ruining us. Daddy remained seated on the couch, hands clasped like he was praying silently. He didn't even lift his head. You are going to fix this, Mama continued. Because I won't have the neighbors whispering about my daughter walking around with a belly full of sin. You've humiliated this family. Clarice stood beside her like she had never done a wrong thing in her life. I tried again. It was just one time. I didn't know. You didn't know? Mama snapped. You didn't know how to keep your legs closed. Her voice cracked like a belt in the air. I didn't raise you to be this, she spat. Whatever this is. I stood there trembling, trying not to cry because crying only made things worse. In this house, weakness wasn't allowed unless it was Mother's. She turned to Daddy. Say something. He finally looked up. His voice was low, flat. You need to leave. I don't know what hurt more. Mama's rage or Daddy's indifference. One was a storm, the other a vacuum. Tonight, Mama added. Before someone sees. They didn't offer options. They didn't ask if I had somewhere to go. They didn't ask if I was scared. They just wanted me gone. Out of sight, out of church gossip. By the time night settled in and the crickets started humming, Mama shoved a small backpack into my arms. 2 shirts, a toothbrush, no money. Clarice handed me a dollar store poncho like she was doing me a favor. Mama didn't hug me. She opened the door. You will not destroy what I built with this family. Get out before the neighbors hear. She didn't even wait to see me leave. The door shut behind me with a click that felt louder than any scream. I stood there barefoot on the porch, rain soaking through my clothes. The world looked different when you're on the outside of a door you used to belong behind. I remember looking down at my feet and wondering if I still existed. I walked down the gravel road alone. No flashlight, no phone. In my pocket were 3 crumpled dollars and the fading echo of my mother's voice repeating like static in my head. Don't come back. The rain didn't let up. It followed me like a shadow all the way to the edge of town. My shoes, if you could call them that, had soaked through before I made it to the main road. I didn't have a destination, just a silent prayer that my feet would take me somewhere that didn't make me feel like I was already a ghost. By the time I reached the gas station with the flickering light above the payphone, I was shivering so hard I could barely press the buttons. I still remembered Ruben's number. He was the one person who hadn't made me feel like I was broken. At least not until he disappeared. The call didn't go through. I tried again and again until the automated voice said the line was no longer in service. I hung up slowly, fingers still wrapped around the greasy metal of the phone like it might suddenly start ringing back, but nothing did. Nothing ever does in real life, not like in the movies. It took me almost 2 full days to walk the stretch to his uncle's house. I stopped behind diners, begged for crackers, drew faces on napkins in exchange for a cup of coffee that made me feel human for 15 minutes. My stomach twisted every time I passed a church billboard or saw a woman holding a toddler. I wasn't angry at them. I was angry at how easy they made motherhood look. Like it came with ribbons and baby showers, not plywood benches and whispers behind closed doors. When I finally made it to the brick duplex where Ruben's uncle lived, I was too exhausted to knock right away. I sat on the curb across the street and watched for hours. No sign of him, no truck in the driveway, no porch light switching on for a girl soaked to the bone and carrying too much weight in her gut and none in her hands. I eventually knocked. The man who answered squinted through the screen door like he already knew why I was there. He's not here, he said flatly. And even if he was, I don't think he's who you need right now. That line didn't come from a place of wisdom. It came from judgment. He didn't know me, but he sure as hell thought he did. He shut the door before I could even ask for water. I slept behind an old gym that night. Curled up on the aluminum bleachers with my backpack as a pillow. I stared at the sky and tried to remember how it used to feel to be wanted. I must have drifted off sometime before dawn because the next thing I remember was the sound of church bells in the distance. I followed them. It wasn't faith pulling me. It was the need for something familiar. The chapel door was locked, so I settled near the back steps where a tiny alcove kept me half dry. The stone was cold against my spine, and I pulled the poncho tighter over my knees as the voices inside carried through the stained glass. Marion said the boy wasn't thinking straight. One woman said, lucky she stepped in before it got worse. The other replied, would have ruined him. My mouth went dry. Marion, my mother. My voice caught in my throat like cotton. She had warned him off. Ruben hadn't left me. She had made sure he did. That meant the silences, the vanishing, the rejection. None of it had been his alone. She orchestrated the disappearance like a conductor waving her baton in a symphony of shame. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my back to the brick wall and realized the truth was worse than abandonment. It was a razor. After that, I stopped looking for anyone. I stopped asking for help, for answers, for forgiveness. Instead, I started drawing. At the Sunday market, I offered quick portraits for whatever people could spare. Fruit, a sandwich, half a bottle of water. I drew kids, couples, tourists who smiled and said I had the touch, never knowing the only thing my fingers wanted was to feel like they still mattered. My belly grew. My silence grew with it. No one asked questions. That's the thing about being visibly pregnant and visibly young in a town like ours. They see what they want and the rest they edit out. I once caught my reflection in the glass of a storefront. For a split second, I didn't recognize myself. There was no family resemblance left. No softness, just a girl who had learned how to disappear while standing still. By week's end, I had nowhere left to wander. The diner owners got tired of me sleeping behind the dumpster. The gym closed off access to the bleachers. The chapel women stopped bringing leftover pastries. That's how I ended up at the thrift store. The one with the dusty mannequin in the window and a faded, closed until further notice sign. The bench outside had one leg shorter than the rest, so every time I shifted, it rocked just enough to remind me I wasn't safe. But that night, I was too tired to care. I laid down on my side, head resting on my bag, one hand over my stomach. The stars were hidden behind heavy clouds. The air smelled like oil and spoiled milk. As I closed my eyes, I thought to myself, the worst part of being abandoned isn't the silence. It's realizing no one is out there calling your name. It must have been just after dawn when the engine pulled up. I didn't lift my head right away. I'd gotten used to the sound of cars passing without stopping. But this one did. Tires ground against gravel and a door opened. Then I heard a woman's voice, sharp, almost rehearsed. There she is. Poor thing's been out here all night. Two figures stood over me. One wore a brown skirt and a navy windbreaker with a cross stitched into the left breast. The other held a clipboard. I didn't bother asking their names. She's perfect for the program, the clipboard lady said, almost like I wasn't even there. They said she was pregnant. I didn't respond. They already knew more about me than I wanted anyone to. They didn't ask where I was going or if I had someone waiting. They said the van was warm and that there would be breakfast. I followed, not because I trusted them, but because I didn't have the strength to argue. The ride was silent, save for gospel radio humming low. The van smelled like ammonia and hand sanitizer, and I counted every bump in the road until we turned onto a long dirt path framed by pine trees. At the end was a rust-colored building 2 stories high with peeling paint and a metal cross bolted to the front door. Above the entrance, "Hope through discipline." I remember thinking it sounded more like a warning than a promise. The woman with the clipboard told me to leave my bag. Said I wouldn't need anything from that life anymore. Another girl, maybe 16, walked by with a broom in her hand and her head down. She didn't glance at me. Inside, the walls were beige and sterile. No clocks, no windows that opened. They took my name, but not my voice. I became a bed number and a meal schedule. The cot they gave me squeaked every time I moved, and the mattress felt like packing foam. We were woken at 5 every morning, cold water showers, no talking during meals. We recited scriptures before breakfast and again before lights out. One girl whispered to me on the second night, asking how far along I was. By the next morning, she was gone. No explanation. I didn't ask questions after that. The staff called us by our last names and only when necessary. Our bodies were treated like evidence of failure. My pregnancy wasn't considered sacred. It was a punishment. One woman in charge, Miss Janine, said it outright. Your body is a consequence, not a miracle. She smiled while saying it, like she just offered a blessing. They kept us busy, scrubbing floors, folding donated clothes, copying Bible verses by hand. We weren't allowed outside alone. If someone cried, they were given an extra shift. If someone refused to pray, they lost their meal. I kept my head down until one afternoon while cleaning shelves in the dusty library. I found a Bible older than any of the others. The leather was cracked and pages curled at the corners. Inside the front cover, in delicate blue ink, was the name Carmela Viend. My fingers froze over the page. I knew that name. My grandmother had whispered it once when she thought I was asleep. She saved me, she'd said when no one else would. I turned the page and found tiny handwritten notes in the margins, verses rewritten in plain language, soft, understanding, the kind of God that didn't punish girls for being human. I stole a pencil stub from the office and returned that night when no one was watching. I sat on the floor between 2 dusty theology books and began writing in the margins, between the lines, underneath the words that had been used to shame me. I told my story not with anger but with precision. The night they kicked me out, the silence from Reuben, the faces of the women in church whispering behind closed doors. I wrote until my fingers ached and the pencil wore down to splinters. Then I put the Bible back where I found it. Not on the shelf, but near the front desk, tucked behind the stack of daily devotionals. If anyone ever read it, they'd see me. Maybe they'd see themselves. Days passed, then a week, then two. I kept waking up, sweeping floors, copying verses, and keeping my thoughts to myself. And then on a Tuesday morning that smelled like wet dirt and disinfectant, I was called to the main office. I walked in slowly. The chair across from the administrator's desk was already taken. A woman sat there in a gray coat holding the Bible. Her hands looked older than her face, worn, but not weak. She looked up and said one sentence I'll never forget. "Your grandmother once saved me. Now I'll return the favor." I followed her out of the office in silence. She didn't ask me any questions, didn't tell me where we were going. The halls felt colder that morning, or maybe it was just me realizing I was walking away from the place that tried to erase me. She handed me a small duffel bag, different from the one I came with, and said, "Let's get you out before they change their minds." An hour later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of her old sedan, watching the rehab center shrink in the rearview mirror. Her name was Dorothy, but she told me to call her Dot. Said Sister Carmela once gave her a bed when nobody else would. Some debts don't get paid with money. You pay them forward. 10 years have passed since then, and if you asked anyone in this town who I am now, you'd get answers that don't even share a border with the truth. It was a Tuesday when it happened. Regular, unassuming. I was wiping down the cafe counter when a teenager strolled in with earbuds and confidence. She looked around, ordered an iced coffee, then did a double take as I rang her up. "You used to live on Everwood Street, right? With the Fab Brooks?" she asked casually. My hands paused over the register. "I used to go to St. Andrews. My mom said you ran off and got pregnant. Your dad's a deacon now." It didn't sting, not in the way it would have years ago. But it cut clean like a paper slice you don't feel until the blood comes. I smiled more out of habit than warmth and handed her the change. When she left, I locked the register, walked to the back room, and just sat. So, this is how it's being told. Not that I was pushed out. Not that my mother slammed the door on me in the pouring rain. Not that they erased me from family photos and Sunday prayers, but that I chose to vanish. Later that week, I found an old bulletin from St. Andrews while sorting donations. There was a photo of my parents, Marion and Eldon, smiling under the banner. 25 years of faith, family, and fellowship. Clarice stood beside them, beaming like she hadn't buried anyone. A short paragraph below called them pillars of moral guidance. I laughed, then I stopped because it wasn't funny. I started collecting, not junk, proof. I took snapshots of church pamphlets, community bulletins, and posts from Clarice's marriage ministry page. There was one sermon transcript where my mother recounted the tale of a prodigal daughter who abandoned faith, but taught us the power of discipline. No names, of course, but anyone who had lived here longer than a decade would know exactly who she meant. She'd rewritten the ending. She'd even rewritten the beginning. One afternoon, I sat with it all spread out on the cafe table. Pages of words, photos, phrases they'd used to reinvent what happened. I thought about burning them. Instead, I folded them all neatly into a folder labeled, "For Leora," because someday she'd ask. The irony came the next week when I got a call from a local nonprofit. They were honoring community advocates who had turned pain into purpose. Someone had nominated me, probably one of the moms I'd helped through the cafe. They asked for a brief bio, and I sent one over. 2 days later, they called again. "We absolutely want to highlight your work," the woman on the phone said. "But given certain sensitivities in your family's public role, would you be open to omitting your last name from the program?" I held the phone to my ear like it had started speaking a language I'd never learned. "You can include it," I said, keeping my voice even. "I just won't say it back." There was a pause followed by a polite, "We'll follow your lead." That weekend, I stopped by the community center to confirm some details for the ceremony. As I stepped out of the car, I passed a poster stapled to a corkboard near the entrance. Clarice's face, smiling, polished, framed in elegant navy blue. The text beneath her read, "Family First." Clarice Fabruch's 7 Keys to a Harmonious Home. I took a photo with my phone, thumb hovering over the upload button for a long time. I didn't post it, not because I didn't have something to say, but because some stories deserve a better stage. And sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's just the inhale before the storm. I slid the phone back into my pocket, leaving the image of Clarice's polished smile where it was, sitting silently in my camera roll like a secret I wasn't ready to spend yet. The wind kicked up just enough to sting my eyes. Or maybe that was something else. I took a deep breath, turned from the board, and walked across the parking lot toward my car. By the time I pulled into the alley behind the cafe, it was past closing. I could see the soft glow from the security light above the back door casting long shadows across the loading ramp. I parked, grabbed a box of donation bread from the passenger seat, and unlocked the door to my place. My real place. The second cradle started with 1 donated oven, 3 mismatched tables, and a girl who barely believed she deserved warmth. Sister Carmela's bequest hadn't been large, but it had been enough to cover the lease on the old bakery space. Everything else, sweat, barter, and the quiet trust of broken women who found their way to me the same way I once found my way to a bench outside a locked thrift store. I didn't design the cafe to feel perfect. I made it feel safe. Soft lights, second-hand books on the windowsills, a free drink board on the wall where strangers covered each other's tabs. It became a place where young women, mostly mothers, mostly ignored, could land without explanation. That night, I sat at the back table to tally invoices when I heard a soft voice call out from the front counter. "Mom." Leora stood in her school sweatshirt, holding a piece of paper with both hands. She looked nervous, like whatever she had written might change something between us. "They gave us an assignment," she said. "We had to write a letter to someone we love but never met." I smiled and patted the seat beside me. She sat down and unfolded the paper. Her voice was steady but low, like she wasn't sure she wanted the words to stay in the air once they came out. "Dear Grandma," she read. "I don't know what your hug feels like, but I think you used to hug my mom. She doesn't say much about you, but when she's sad, she gets real quiet. And I wonder if that's your voice inside her head. I hope you're okay, even if we don't talk. I hope you think about my mom sometimes. She's really strong and I love her, that's all." She folded the letter again and handed it to me. I didn't cry. Instead, I kissed her forehead and told her I'd keep it somewhere special. After she left for the night, I slipped the note into the old cookie tin under the register next to my GED certificate, the photo of Sister Carmela, and the first ever receipt from the cafe's opening day. That tin wasn't about keepsakes. It was proof of roots, of choice, of survival. The next morning, I came in early to restock before the Saturday rush. I hadn't even finished unpacking the syrup crates when I noticed something new pinned to the bulletin board in the staff corner. A quilt, handmade, simple, stitched in warm tones. It wasn't store-bought. Each square had a name embroidered into it, not the names of children. The names were of the women who had passed through these doors and found something more than caffeine. Jazan, Renee, Kiara, Molly. At the bottom corner, one square read, "Alpha gave us back our names." I didn't say anything. I just stood there for a long time, my fingers resting lightly over the thread. It was the first time I'd felt seen, not because of what I had survived, but because of what I'd built. That night, after the last espresso machine hissed its final sigh and the floor had been swept, I was wiping down the front counter when I heard a knock at the door. It was raining again. Not the kind of rain that roars. It was the quiet kind that slips down windows like it's trying to sneak past your attention. Outside stood a girl, 16, maybe 17, hood pulled tight, shoes soaked, arms wrapped around herself like her own body was a burden. I opened the door. She didn't ask if we were still open. She didn't offer a name. She just looked at me with eyes I recognized. They said you'd understand, she whispered. And I did. She didn't need to tell me her story. I saw it in her posture, in the way she flinched at warmth and braced for rejection. I gave her a towel, a seat, and silence, because sometimes that's all anyone needs to take a breath. The next morning, after making sure the girl had a warm meal and clean clothes from the donation closet, I walked 2 blocks to the church hall where Marian and Eldon's anniversary celebration was scheduled. I didn't go home to change. I didn't curl my hair or find anything appropriate to wear. I showed up as I was, someone who had survived their absence, not someone begging to rejoin it. The sun was starting to dip by the time I reached the entrance. Through the wide windows, I could see people laughing over decorated tables, the room trimmed in gold and white. A slideshow played against the back wall, flashing images of my parents smiling at weddings, baptisms, ribbon cuttings. Clarice stood near the front, surrounded by polished men and women who clung to her like she was some kind of prize. No one noticed when I walked in. Or maybe they did, but they weren't brave enough to say anything. The room smelled like smoked ham and flower arrangements. I made my way to the front without hesitation, my boots echoing softly against the tile floor. The MC, a family friend who hadn't spoken to me since I was 13, paused mid-sentence as I approached the podium. "I won't be long," I said calmly. "Just a few words." The silence that followed was thick with tension. My mother's expression froze, her fingers still resting on the edge of her wineglass. Clarice tilted her head, smiling like I was a childhood prank, resurfacing for a moment of attention. I didn't let them distract me. "I want to thank this community," I began, scanning the room, not for the casseroles or the condolences, because those were never offered, but for making it very clear what I never wanted to become. I reached into my coat pocket and unfolded a check. "This is from the women at the second cradle," I said. "It's a donation in memory of someone who believed I had value, even when my own family turned their backs." Her name was Sister Carmela. She didn't ask what I'd done. She only asked if I was hungry. I placed the check on the table in front of Marian without looking at her. "You preach about grace every Sunday," I said. "Maybe now you'll have a chance to practice it." I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "You can't change what you were," she said under her breath, words so bitter they could curdle milk. I looked at her then, not through the eyes of a daughter, but of a woman who had clawed her way back to life with no help from the people who should have fought for her. "No," I said quietly. "But I've changed what I am, and what I won't be ever again is your daughter." I didn't wait for applause or approval. I walked out the same way I came in. Outside, the air was thick with humidity. As I stepped into the evening, the sun finally dipped below the steeple, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I could still hear muffled music inside, some old gospel tune. But another sound rose beneath it, scattered clapping. Not from the head table, but from the back corner where the nobodies sat. The ones who watched quietly but remembered everything. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I had spoken for the girl they'd tried to erase, and she was finally heard. The walk back to the cafe that night wasn't long, but it felt heavier than usual. Not from what had been said inside that banquet hall, but from everything I didn't say. I'd left the pieces of myself I used to defend behind that podium, and I didn't miss them. But I knew Clarice wouldn't let it rest. She never had. By Sunday morning, it started. I was restocking the napkin dispenser behind the counter when Mara, one of our regulars, came in waving her phone. "You seen this?" she asked, eyes wide like she was about to spill the secret of the decade. I took her phone and tapped play. There she was. Clarice, hair curled into soft waves, dress a shade of church-approved lavender, seated on a floral couch in a morning segment called Family and Faith. A title card called her a certified family counselor, something I didn't even know she'd become. She smiled into the camera. "We talk a lot about forgiveness in our community, but forgiveness begins at home when daughters know their place and mothers have the courage to set boundaries even when it hurts." I stood frozen behind the register. Mara watched me, unsure if she should keep talking. The interviewer leaned in, asking Clarice about the cost of raising girls in today's world. She nodded solemnly like someone who had just buried a war hero. Sometimes, she said, the hardest part of being a mother is letting go of the child you raised so the woman they became doesn't destroy the rest of the family. I handed the phone back without a word. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't curse, didn't slam a mug, didn't even blink hard. Instead, I walked into the office, opened the drawer beneath the old register, and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside was the letter Sister Carmela had written for me years ago, the one she'd hand-delivered to get me out of that so-called reform camp. Her handwriting had faded, but her words hadn't. She deserves space, not shame. Light, not silence. And she will not be defined by anyone's version of her story but her own. I taped it to the cafe's front window. No commentary, no caption, just truth. By noon, Clarissa's clip had gone local viral. Shared by women from the church, reposted in parenting groups, echoed by people who'd never met me, but felt confident enough to weigh in anyway. Some people turn trauma into branding. Guess the cafe is more about attention than coffee. Maybe if she'd followed the rules, she'd be part of the family by now. My inbox filled with vague threats. One man wrote, "You had your 15 minutes. Sit down." Another asked if I thought being a victim came with a paycheck. I didn't respond. I didn't post a rebuttal. I didn't explain because I wasn't the one who needed the last word. That afternoon, Belle came in early for her shift. She was 17, soft-spoken, with a daughter who refused to nap unless the coffee grinder was running. She didn't say much at first, just cleaned the tables and restocked the tea bags. Then she looked at me and said, "They don't scare me." I blinked. What? Those people online, they think if they shout loud enough, you'll go quiet. But you didn't, and neither will I. The next morning, Belle posted a video from her phone. Just her sitting on the front steps of the second cradle, her daughter babbling in the background. Alpha didn't save me. She didn't rescue me. She reminded me I wasn't disposable. She gave me more than a place to sleep. She gave me back my name. And maybe that's what scares people like Clarice. The video didn't explode like Clarissa's clip had. It didn't go viral overnight, but it started to circulate, and with it came real comments. People who said they'd been through similar things. Women who said they'd been the daughter that got left behind. That week, the same channel that aired Clarissa's segment called me. "We'd like to offer you an opportunity to respond," the producer said, tone all polished courtesy. "No, thank you," I said, a beat of silence. "Would you be willing to send a statement?" I thought about it, then emailed back a single sentence. You don't need both sides of the story when one side paid to silence the other. That night, after closing, I stayed behind to sweep the back hallway and count out the drawer. The door was locked. The lights were low. I was just about to turn in when it happened. Glass shattered. I turned, heart in my throat, and saw the front window cracked from a rock. It lay on the cafe floor next to a paper scrap, the edges torn unevenly like it had been ripped from a notebook. I picked it up. One word was scrawled across it in black ink. Gratitude. I read it 3 times before setting it down. Sometimes the final straw doesn't break you. It sharpens you. The word stayed with me long after I swept up the glass. Gratitude scrawled like a joke or a threat. I wasn't sure which. Either way, I didn't flinch. I taped a trash bag over the broken pane and finished the night like I always did. Counting the drawer, wiping the counters, making sure everything was clean for the next day. Some things you just do on principle. 2 weeks passed. We replaced the window, but I didn't cover the crack in our reputation. Not that I ever tried to anymore. What people thought of me had long since stopped being my business. Leora, on the other hand, still carried the weight of my story like it was part of her name. It was a Tuesday when she came home quiet, too quiet. She usually sang on the walk from school, or at least hummed while making a snack. But that day, she dropped her backpack by the door and sat at the kitchen table without touching her sandwich. "They took me out of the youth choir," she said after a long pause. I turned from the sink, drying my hands on a towel. "What do you mean took you out?" She didn't look up. They said they're making changes, but I heard Mrs. Atkins whispering to another mom. She said, "It's hard to expect moral clarity when the apple falls from a broken tree." That was all I needed to hear. I didn't call the church. I didn't email anyone. I didn't ask for a meeting. Instead, I walked into the second cradle's back room and pulled out the community calendar we used to schedule events. The last Saturday of the month was open. So, I booked it. We printed flyers. Nothing fancy, just bold letters across the top. Our daughters, our voices. Below it, a photo of Leora with her hands over a piano keyboard and a list of performers. Children of the women who worked here, kids who had lived through too much and still showed up with hearts wide open. The night of the showcase, the cafe was packed. We moved out half the tables and borrowed folding chairs from the library down the street. One of our regulars brought extra string lights. Someone donated a mic and an amp. The whole place buzzed with nervous joy. Leora stood behind the curtain I'd fashioned from a thrifted bed sheet, holding her sheet music with trembling hands. "You don't have to do this," I told her. "I want to," she said, "not to prove anything, just because I want my voice in the room." When she stepped out, the room went still. Not because she was perfect, not because she was polished, but because she stood there unafraid to be seen. She sang a song about choosing to stay soft in a world that doesn't deserve it. And when she finished, nobody clapped right away. They were too stunned. Then someone stood up. And another. And then the entire room erupted in applause, so full it felt like the roof might lift off. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat with her on the cafe couch, still in her dress shoes, her hair frizzy from the heat. She looked at me and asked, "Were you ever in that picture?" It took me a second to realize what she meant. A few days earlier, I had returned to the house I grew up in. I didn't knock. I didn't expect anyone to be there. The porch was dusty, the lock barely holding. I used the key I'd never given back. Inside, everything looked smaller. The hallway still smelled like old perfume and floor polish. On the wall just past the kitchen hung the same family photo that used to sit above the fireplace. Only now I wasn't in it. My image had been cleanly cut out. No torn edges, no scribbles, just a rectangular absence where I used to be. I didn't cry. I took out my phone and snapped a picture of the picture. Then I went to the kitchen, left a sealed envelope on the counter, and walked out. Inside the envelope was a new photo. Me, Leora, the women of the cafe, the ones who knew how to hold space and tell the truth. "This is the family I built." The note inside read. "The one that didn't need scissors." Back on the couch, I looked at my daughter. "No," I told her, "but I finally got to take the one that mattered." She leaned her head on my shoulder and we sat like that for a while. No music, no noise, just two people who had survived the same storm from different lifeboats. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible, even walking away. It was early October, the kind of fall morning where the air has just enough bite to remind you the seasons are shifting. The sidewalks in front of the cafe were damp with yesterday's rain and leaves stuck to the brick like half-forgotten promises. I was refilling the napkin holders when one of the girls handed me a padded envelope. "No return address," she said, placing it on the counter. The handwriting on the front was familiar, too careful to be natural. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. I waited until the cafe quieted before opening it in the back office. Inside was a letter from Ruben. Typed mostly, but at the bottom he'd scribbled a few sentences by hand, like he needed me to hear his real voice after all this time. There were printouts, too. Screenshots of text messages. My mother's messages. "Cut ties immediately. You think this girl is going to give you a future? She'll drag you into the dirt and take your name with her. Don't throw away your life over someone who doesn't understand shame." There were more, some of them uglier, others quiet in their cruelty, but they all told the same story. He hadn't just left me. He'd been told to vanish. I read the first page of his letter. Halfway through the second, I stopped. There was no anger, no shaking hands, just stillness. I folded the letter, walked to the back alley where we kept the compost bins, and burned it inside a metal coffee can. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't closure. It was clarity. I didn't need him to explain why he'd gone silent. I didn't need to understand every detail. I didn't need another chapter in a story I had already rewritten without him. That afternoon, just as we were closing up for the day, a man in a navy windbreaker stepped inside. He looked to be in his 60s. The lines on his face weren't harsh, just heavy, like someone who carried too many secrets for too long. He took off his cap and held it in both hands. "I was an elder at St. Andrew's," he said. I nodded, waiting. "I remember you. You were 13 when you stopped coming. I knew something wasn't right. I saw the way I should have said something." He looked down. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was a family matter. But truth is, I was just scared. Scared of being on the wrong side of a woman like Marion Fabbrooke. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I was a coward. I didn't offer him comfort. That wasn't mine to give. But I did offer him something else." "Then this is your place now," I said. "Say something to the next girl." He nodded slowly, wiped his eyes, walked out into the fading light. 2 days later, I loaded the trunk with a cooler full of snacks, 2 bottles of sweet tea, a couple of blankets, and the small overnight bag I kept ready for moments like this. Leora thought we were just taking one of our aimless weekend drives, music loud, windows down, no real destination. She sprawled across the passenger seat, sneakers on the dash, humming along to whatever was playing through her earbuds, completely unaware we were heading somewhere that mattered. I took Highway 49 south out of town, then turned off onto narrower county roads, and finally onto red dirt trails that kicked up clouds of rust-colored dust behind us. The drive felt longer than the miles suggested, the way a journey back into memory always does. Every mile carried me farther from the life I had built and closer to the one I'd once crawled out of. The little plot sat on the edge of Savannah, Georgia, just a few acres of wild grass and scattered oaks. Sister Carmel's grave rested beneath a weeping willow whose branches swept the ground like long green fingers. The headstone was plain, nothing fancy, her name, the years she'd been given, nothing more. Someone still came by to keep the grass trimmed. I wondered who, but I didn't need to know. I laid the bundle of wildflowers I'd gathered along the roadside, black-eyed Susans, Queen Anne's lace, a few stubborn purple thistles, right at the base of the stone. Leora pulled a folded sheet of notebook paper from her jacket pocket, the edges soft from being carried too long. She cleared her throat, stood a little straighter, and read aloud in a voice that started shaky but grew steady. "Thank you for helping my mom. If you hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here at all." She folded the paper again, smaller and smaller, then slipped it under the flowers like a secret. I reached into my own pocket and drew out one of Carmel's old letters, the one she'd pressed into my hand the week I walked out of the camp for good. The paper was yellowed, the ink faintly faded, the creases deep from years of being carried. I read it slowly, letting the words settle over the quiet ground. Some roots aren't meant to be replanted in the same dirt. They're only meant to grow forward. The willow leaves rustled above us. Leora leaned her head against my arm for a moment, no tears, just wait. We stayed until the light began to soften, then walked back to the car without needing to say it was time. On the drive home, somewhere past a sagging, rust-red barn half swallowed by kudzu, Leora pulled one earbud out and asked, barely above the engine noise, "Are you still mad at Grandma?" I watched the road unroll in front of us, white lines flickering under the tires. "No," I said after a long breath. "Not mad anymore. Not close either. Just, finished." She nodded like she'd known the answer before she asked, then put the earbud back in and let the music take her the rest of the way home. That evening the cafe had slipped into its familiar lull. The overhead lights were turned low, the last of the day's crumbs swept into neat piles, the smell of coffee grounds and cinnamon still hanging in the air. I was running the broom near the register when the bell above the door gave its soft chime. A girl stood there, 17, maybe 18, shoulders curled inward like she was trying to take up less space. Her eyes darted across the room as if checking for exits, for judgment, for any sign she shouldn't be here. She didn't say a word. I didn't ask. I just tilted my head toward the small table by the front window, the one that catches the last of the streetlight. Sit, I said, soft as I could. Coffee's hot. Pie's fresh. You don't have to explain anything tonight. She hesitated another heartbeat, then crossed the floor, pulled the chair out, and folded herself into it, tugging her sleeves down over her knuckles. I glanced around the room I'd built from nothing, the mismatched chairs, the bulletin board thick with flyers for jobs, apartments, support groups, lawyers who don't charge if you can't pay. The walls were covered in photographs, women who had once walked through that same door carrying the same silence. Some stayed a night. Some stayed years. Some sent postcards from places they never thought they'd reach. The picture closest to the register used to be small, just me and baby Leora, both of us squinting into the sun. It's bigger now, reprinted and enlarged last spring. Carmel's face is in the center, arms around both of us, and circling outward are a dozen more women, laughing, serious, mid-sentence, alive. They never had to welcome me back into anything. I built the welcome itself. I built a place where nobody ever has to leave unless they're damn good and ready. For years I waited for the apology that would make it all make sense, some knock on the door, some voice finally saying, I was wrong. I thought healing required that neat bow, that spoken acknowledgement. But life doesn't hand out tidy closures. Sometimes the only closure you get is the moment you decide you're done waiting. You square your shoulders, you pick up whatever you still have, and you walk forward, head high, even if nobody claps, even if nobody ever looks back.